Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Analese Chandler-Nieves. I am one of the Public Service Fellows for Arts and Culture Programming. I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar where we will provide more information about Minority Arts and Education Fund. Before we get started, a Minority Arts and Education Fund is a grant for people of color. Because of that, we want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory and homelands of the people of Lenape, Delaware, Shawnee, Wyandotte, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other Great Lake tribes like Chippewa, Kickapoo, Wee, Penobscot, Kaskaskia. We want to express our gratitude and honor the past and present tribes that reside in the home we now call Northeast Ohio. Next, before we get started, we would also like to take a quick poll with 2 questions. The questions are, have you ever applied for an MEF grant before? And have you previously applied for grant funding? And this doesn't have to be just with the Cleveland Foundation, this could be with any other philanthropic entity. We'll wait another couple minutes, more seconds to see if anyone else needs to answer. Okay, now we have the finances. It looks like a lot of people have experience with applying for grants, and a good amount have applied for the MEF grant before. Now I will pass it on to Courtney, who will go along with the rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Analese. My name is Courtney Barton. I'm the Program Director for Arts and Culture and Racial Equity Initiatives at the Cleveland Foundation. I am really excited to see that there is a high degree of familiarity with applying for grants among the attendees here specifically, and with the Minority Arts and Education Fund in particular. There have been some minor changes to this program this year because we have really been living in a very tumultuous year. But before I go forward, I would just like to really thank Analese for putting this webinar together. We've been working to pivot the work that we are doing to be safe and responsive and accessible. We are recording this so that we can post it later on so that people can refer to it. People who are unable to attend this webinar can get their questions answered about this fund specifically. So with that, let's get started. Analese, if you can advance the slide, please. Okay, so a lot of people here do have some familiarity with the Minority Arts and Education Fund, so I'll just give a really quick overview of the background of the fund and why it was established. It was established in 1994 based off of a CPRE settlement for a lawsuit. And it allowed the Cleveland Foundation to establish an endowed fund to provide for the planning, preparation, production, and presentation of cultural and education programming, which benefited and promoted Cleveland's minority populations. It's important to stress that it is an endowed fund. It was endowed with $3.6 million specifically. That means that we are not touching that corpus of the endowment for grant. Rather, it is earnings of interest from the fund that provides grants. From 1996 to 2012, The fund specifically supported the startup and operations of the Cleveland Minority Cable Channel, a public access television station, which subsequently folded. And then in 2012, after the folding of that channel, the board of the Minority Arts and Education Fund, because it is technically an independent 501c3 organization, which the Cleveland Foundation provides administrative support for. The board of the Minority Arts and Education Fund developed a request for proposals to award grants between the amounts of $5,000 and $20,000 roughly to support arts and cultural programming that targeted communities of color. If you can advance the slide, please. So in 2017, which was about the year before I took this position at the Cleveland Foundation, Minority Arts and Education Fund funded 21 proposals. And we received maybe about 30 proposals in that year. In the last few years, and we will get into how the strategy has changed for this fund in the next slide, but in the last few years, we've seen explosive growth in the amount of proposals that we have received for this fund. Accordingly, we have actually been able to increase the number of grants that we have awarded from this fund. So in 2019, we were actually able to fund 35 proposals from this fund for an amount totaling $423,000. And I want you all to know that we're funding in all disciplines and all areas of arts and culture, all sorts of activities. We do not have a narrow definition of arts and culture. It's a very expansive definition. So if you can think of it, and if it fits into an artistic and cultural expression in the community that you serve, we are open to receiving an application about that. Can you advance the slide, Analese? Thank you. So I mentioned our new strategy. In 2018, the board of the Minority Arts and Education Fund adopted a very specific strategy with two prongs. Number one, to strengthen or grow the organizational capacity of arts and cultural organizations that are specifically led by and serving people of color. And I want to be very clear, both led by and serving. It's not an either or proposition. And the second part is to provide fellowships for artists of color. And there's some good reasoning about why we focus specifically on people of color with the work that we are doing. If you can advance the slide, Analese. To give you a little bit of context, I participate in the Grantmakers for the Arts, which is an organization for arts grantmakers from across the country. And Grantmakers for the Arts has done a lot of research on what kinds of support communities of color get for their arts and cultural organizations. There has been some really stark findings, namely that less than 4% of all foundation grant making goes to arts and cultural organizations that are led by and serving people of color. And again, not or, led by and serving people of color. And that's actually worse than overall philanthropic giving. Overall philanthropic giving, about 8% of all grants goes to organizations that are led by and serving people of color, only 4% in the arts. Arts and culture typically likes to pride itself on being open and diverse, but we see that funding has not kept up with that. And so Grantmakers in the Arts has adopted the statement that you see before them, which is essentially to explain that we know that grant making has been inequitable, access to funding to support work has been inequitable, and we are working to reverse these inequities. And that is why we have adopted the strategy of providing grants specifically to arts organizations that are led by and serving people of color, or to provide grants for fellowships for artists of color. I will note that with the fellowship grants, we are open to receiving fellowship applications from organizations that are not led by people of color, simply because we do understand that sometimes there can be issues with capacity to administer a fellowship. It's not a simple and straightforward process. And if a particular artist does have a relationship with an organization that is not led by a person of color, but that organization is willing to administer the grant according to the artistic vision of the fellow who is an artist of color, the Minority Arts and Education Fund would be willing to accept an application for that purpose. Analese, if you could advance the slide, please. So we talked about the fact that these applications are open. We're accepting proposals around two prongs, and the first prong is about capacity. When we talk about capacity, it has the potential, I think, to sort of descend into philanthropic jargon. So I want to make sure that I'm very clear about what we mean when we say organizational capacity. Capacity, I like to think of it as, what is it that your organization does? What is your mission? What is your vision? And I like to differentiate between mission and vision. Mission is what your organization does, how it does its work. Vision is what the world would look like if the organization is 100% successful in implementing its mission. So, what does your organization do? And then, what does your organization need in order to do that? It can threaten sometimes to border on project support. And especially in the year that we have been having, I want to make sure that we really focus on capacity. Because I think sometimes, especially in communities of color, arts organizations do a project here and a project there, but have a really difficult time accessing funding to support organizational growth, right? How do you keep the lights on? How do you pay the people that are doing the work? It is a lot more than just showing up for the event or for the project. You got to keep the organization running around the clock, around the calendar, in order to plan, in order to grow. And that is what we mean by capacity. It can sometimes tie into program delivery, but think about the Minority Arts and Education Fund as an opportunity for your organization to say, you know what we really need is an administrative assistant in order to help us get over, go through all of our records that we have been collecting since we've been in operation, answer the phone, help us send out, fundraising pieces, that sort of thing. Or maybe we need space and we really need to pay our rent so that we can continue to operate in this space. That is what we mean by organizational capacity. If you can advance the slide, please. Fellowship, a fellowship for an artist of color. I think we've also seen some difficulty in explaining what we mean by fellowship. And so I hope that I'm clear. Again, if you have questions, we will be taking a Q&A. So put your questions into the Q&A box about anything that we have been talking about. When we say fellowship, I want to be very clear that we are differentiating between a fellowship and a teaching artist position. And the main difference that I would say exists between an artist fellowship and a teaching artist position is that an artist fellowship gives the artist funding to work on their own practice, their own self-directed practice. If you are an organization that is interested in hosting an artist fellowship, you should note that it would be up to you as the nonprofit organization with a 501c3, because all applicants must have a 501c3, to provide fiscal guidance and oversight of the grant funds. The best case scenario is also to provide some assistance if you are able with connecting to audiences or resources, although sometimes there may be some partnerships where really all the artists need is somebody who can accept the grant with a 501c3 and the artist has all of those connections. In the best case scenario, there will exist synergy between what the artist is attempting to accomplish and perhaps what the organization is attempting to accomplish. So it could very well be a community development corporation who is interested in hosting an artist to do work at their own self-direction, because it's important for the artist to maintain control of the artistic vision. But perhaps you give them rein to engage with, residents of the neighborhood that you serve, developing their own project. There can also be an opportunity for a fellow to develop leadership level arts management practice. And sometimes that can be really difficult. We know lots of people start nonprofit organizations or go into working for nonprofit organizations because they have a passion for the work that they are doing, but they may or may not have much experience with organizational management, with running an organization or learning how that goes. So if there is an opportunity for an artist to collaborate with an organization that also includes some organizational management experience, that would be acceptable too. But it really goes down to the artist maintaining full artistic control and autonomy as opposed to a teaching artist who is implementing perhaps somebody else's vision or curriculum. If we can move forward with the slides, please. Okay, so we talked about how 2020 has been a really tumultuous year. I can tell you that in my overall work with the Cleveland Foundation, we have been really, really concerned, number one, with facilitating the safety of our community. With that in mind, our board has decided that it is not yet ready to accept proposals that involve public gatherings. And I will say that, you know, perhaps a year from now, because the grant timeline will be for the year 2021, we might be in a very different position. But for now, we are asking that you use this as an opportunity to think about what you need to do organizational capacity wise to keep the work going, as opposed to applying for public gatherings. There are lots of art programming that can be delivered safely, perhaps virtually, perhaps a public art installation, that sort of thing, and you need capacity support for that sort of work. We are asking not to move forward with applications at this time for festivals or things of that nature, because we're simply not yet ready to move forward with them. And that might require some different thinking about the proposal that you advance. But I would just reiterate, I know that it is really hard, especially for small arts organizations and especially for arts organizations that are led by people of color, to find the funding that really keeps the lights on or helps to upgrade the technology or that sort of thing. This is the ideal time to apply for that, or a strategic plan or business planning, financial oversight assistance if you need to contract somebody for that assistance, HR assistance, administrative assistance. Think of this as your opportunity to do that. If we get into a different place in the future and you happen to be awarded a grant and you get other things taken care of and you might need some flexibility, because it is also important for us to be flexible at this time, we can have that conversation. But I just want to put that caveat out there. We see in some communities, infection rates continue to rise, and we don't want to be a part of the continued infection, especially because we know that it has a disproportionately devastating effect on communities of color, and that's not what we're trying to do right now. Analese, if you could advance the slide, please. Okay. So I've been talking quite a bit about some of the background of the fund. I want to show you what the application process is like. So if you go to the Cleveland Foundation website and you click at the top bar for applying for a grant under the grants tab there, you will come to this page, right? The welcome page where you can log into our grants portal. We are not accepting proposals in hard copy. We are accepting proposals online only, which means you will need to register for access to our website. If you do not yet have access, you see in the middle, in that lavender colored box under grants, it says click here to request access. You can fill out a form. You will need to put in the 501c3 information of the organization that is applying for the grant. And again, we can only accept proposals directly from organizations that already have a 501c3 due to IRS regulations. And I will also note that we are open to fiscally sponsored projects. So if you are, say, a nascent or even operating for some time organization or collective without a 501c3, but you have a partnership with somebody with a 501c3 that can apply, this is the place where they either register for access to our grants gateway or they can log in directly. Please note, especially around this time of year, we get a lot of requests for credentials. Unfortunately, providing credentials is primarily a manual process. So give yourself a lot of time. If you are interested in applying or you only think that you might be interested in applying, please request access now if you do not already have it, or if you had it but you're not quite sure what your credentials are anymore and you need to reset. Our team in grants management does a Herculean job, but there's only so many people that work there. We want to make sure that we give people enough time to do the work that is needed to provide access. Once you get credentials, over on the left under registered users is where you will log in to access the application form. Can you advance the slide, please? Okay, so when you get into the form, you will scroll all the way down to the bottom where you will see specifically the Minority Arts and Education Fund. Make sure you complete the proposal form that is marked Minority Arts and Education Fund and not the general proposal form. That just makes sure that the application that you're submitting gets routed to the right place. If you think you may have messed up, just reach out to grants management and let us know. But let's try and use specifically the Minority Arts and Education form for this proposal. Now, in the first year that we redid our guidelines to focus primarily on organizations that are led by people of color, we really came to find out essentially that a lot of our applicants didn't have a lot of experience applying for grants. I think that, in this webinar, we have a lot more people with experience applying for grants. So some of this may be redundant information for you. I was a fundraiser for about 12 years before I went back to school and wound up working at the Cleveland Foundation. And I used to organize the proposals that I would work for organizations where I worked around the 5 W's and the H from, elementary school or middle school language arts class. Who, what, where, why, when, and how. And it struck me that we don't want to pretend that people know how to read our minds at the Cleveland Foundation, and we should ask direct questions so that we can get direct answers from people, especially people who may not have had experience applying for grants before. So that is what we sought to do. Our questions are organized around who, what, where, why, when, and how. And if you answer all of those questions in any grant application that you're applying for, you will have a complete grant application. So it is my hope, if you only have a little bit of experience applying for grants, once you complete the Minority Arts and Education Fund application form, you will have some basic boilerplate information that you can use to apply for other grant opportunities as well. So think of it as somewhat evergreen. So we're asking for a project summary. Give us the quick and dirty of what it is that you're trying to do or what your organization represents. We are a dance organization that specializes in Caribbean dance forms, or we are a music organization that specializes in traditional indigenous song, or whatever it is that you do. Give us a really quick overview of what that is in your project summary. Under who? Think about the questions that you may see here on this slide as the things that you will want to make sure you address in a few sentences in your paragraph here in the box in this form. So tell us about who you are, why you're doing what you're doing, the medium you work in. Do you have any project partners that are really significant? Who is the audience that you are serving? Is there going to be a fiscal agent that will also be working with you? Who comes to your shows or who participates in the work that you do and who does the work that you are doing? Under the question of what amount of money will you need? What will the money be used for? What are your goals? And goals are intended outcomes are going to be really important for you to share with us, and think about that. And I encourage you to be ambitious. The grant amounts that we're talking about are between $5,000 and $20,000, but it's really, really helpful for the Board of Minority Arts and Education Fund to understand what you see yourself doing eventually and what you're trying to achieve. Because I will just know that when you're applying for a grant, it's helpful to get some buy-in to what it is that you're trying to do and help us understand the urgency and the importance of the work that you are doing. Next slide, please. Where are you going to be doing this work? Do you have your own space? What neighborhood will it be in? Will you need to rent space? Will it be outdoors? Again, with COVID-19, think really, really hard about, the space that you will be operating in. Will it need to be virtual? That's acceptable here as well. When were you going to begin and when are you going to end? What's the timeline for this project? How? And this is where I think you want to talk about the particularities of your organization. What is it that distinguishes your organization from perhaps another organization? Like, how is your method or your technique different? What is your statement of purpose, and how do you move in the world as either an artist or an arts and cultural organization? And then tell us how this grant is going to help strengthen your organization and how this grant will help you do the work that you set out to do for yourself. The next slide, please. Why? Why is it important? Why now? Why should the Board of the Minority Arts and Education Fund support this request? And this is your opportunity to pitch why it is that your organization needs the support. I will say that we are going to do our best to keep our funding level equal to last year. I know that the needs are increasing. We always get many, many more requests for support than we can possibly fund, unfortunately. So tell us why now, why this is urgent for you and your community right now so that we can get a good handle on it. I will also say, if you don't have a lot of experience applying for grants, and you get an unfavorable response, meaning that the fund is not able to support your request at this time, don't take it personally, because again, we do get a lot more requests than we are able to fund in any given year. And sometimes the decisions can be really hard and are not terribly satisfying about what we can fund when. If you have questions about that after the fact, after decisions come out, please contact us so that we can work with you. And lastly, a question that did not appear last year, but it's helpful for us to understand how COVID-19 is affecting your organization and the work of your organization. I have a suspicion that COVID-19 is going to be especially difficult for small and mid-sized arts organizations. And the information that you provide for this answer will help us overall to understand how we can be of better support to the community at this time. And lastly, we give you an additional information box. It is not required, but if there is anything that you think that we should know that didn't neatly fit into any other of the questions that we ask, please use the additional information box to tell us that question or that information. Next slide, please. All right, so budgeting. Again, grants will be awarded between the amounts of $5,000 and $20,000. In the last few years, there were very, very few grants that we were able to fund at the $20,000 amount, and very, very few grants that we were able to fund as the entirety of their request. So it's important for you to give us some detail about how the funds will be used and where perhaps other sources of funding will be coming from. This is the top half of the grant budget form that you will find in the gateway when you are applying for the grant. Please, 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 please use this form. Do not use a different form. Do not use a different Excel document or something that you download from perhaps QuickBooks. We need to see it on this form in this format for our analysis purposes. I know that sometimes for small organizations, it can be really difficult to figure out exactly how much money you will have coming in from other spaces. So it's fine to utilize that anticipated column, but this is for overall, this is where money will be coming from for this project, or where you hope money will be coming from for this project. If you need to explain things to us about, circumstances, perhaps it's matching, in kind, mean perhaps somebody is providing you services or donating space or that sort of thing, make sure you put that there, but be as descriptive as possible. Next slide, please. This part, the bottom part, is project expenses, meaning where you will need to spend money in order to accomplish the work that you need to accomplish. One thing that I note very frequently is that people undersell how much it costs to do the work that you do. So please don't do that to yourself. Again, cannot promise that we can provide all the funds that you need to do the work, but it is helpful for us to understand. People need to be paid. Pay people for the work that they do. You may need to, use consulting services. If you're interested in doing a strategic plan, you would probably put the amount that you would pay the planner under consultants and professional services, or perhaps if you're contracting HR or fiscal oversight, you would probably put that there. Travel, if you got to get somewhere, and perhaps you need RTA support, or perhaps you need Ubers, or perhaps you need to reimburse for mileage or something of that sort. Put that in that line item right there. Equipment, if you need to upgrade technology, if you need furnishings, right? Like if you've got a space and you need a desk for it, put that there. Office supplies and materials. I have certainly seen proposals where people say that they want to print and distribute zines, but they neglect to fill in the fact that they need paper and toner in order to do that. Put supplies and materials there. Postage and mailing, I think, is relatively self-explanatory. I think perhaps in the times of COVID, we've seen a lot of organizations that are doing virtual work, especially with youth often, but they want to make sure that the youth have the supplies and materials that they need, and they're going to need to send out packages. You may need to put that there to make sure that the people that you're working with have the supplies and materials that they need. Indirect expenses. This is where you're paying your rent and your electric bill as an organization. If that's something that you need, put that in that line item. Other, again, I don't know what other might be for the work that you are doing, but I just want to make sure that you use every line item that is available to you. Don't undersell what it is that you need to do. The bottom talks about land acquisitions. Those are things that we consider capital expenses. We are not funding capital expenses during the time of the COVID-19 crisis. I think it's really important for us to really focus on making sure that we are funding so that people have, honestly, salaries so that they can pay their bills and take care of their families. And that's where generally the priority for the Cleveland Foundation is going at this time. Next slide, please. And a little bit about the timeline. So we've talked about how we adopted the strategy that is giving preference to arts organizations that are led by people of color or for artists of color. That was in 2018. We worked really hard this year, and it would not have been possible without Analese to release this RFP a couple of weeks earlier than we did in previous years so that we could give people more time. In the last 2 years, it was released at the end of September. This year, it's being released on September 1st. So please use the time, please spread the word. The webinar, oh, that was the wrong date. We ended up changing the date for the webinar because we realized that we had originally scheduled it for Labor Day. And we figured that people wanted some time off because it's been a hard couple of months. So forgive that typo there. We would like to get all of our proposals in by the end of October, so that's October 30th. The Board of the Minority Arts and Education Fund will be meeting in early December to review proposals. So the time in between October 30th and December will allow a staff to organize. We got 500 pages of application materials last year, and there were 2 of us, Analese and I, were the ones that were working on it. So we wanted to make sure that we had enough time to go through all of the application materials and ask questions if we needed to ask questions of you. Grants will be awarded then in early December, and then they will be paid out, and we'll have to verify the timeline. Since the COVID-19 crisis, the Cleveland Foundation has been working to pay out grants on a faster than usual schedule. So usually in previous years, grants would be paid out by the end of the month after you received word. So if your grant were awarded in December, you would receive payment by the end of January. We've been working really hard as a staff to get grants out earlier because we know that it's a difficult time. So you will be notified about when to expect payment of the grant, depending on where we are in the midst of this crisis. The grant term is calendar year 2021. But if there are issues, please feel free to reach out to us. If you think that you're awarded a grant and you need more time, you need to change your timeline, stretch it out a little bit. We're trying to be really flexible at this time, so please feel free to keep us informed and let us know. And then we're asking for final reports in December 2021. So I think that's all that we have for prepared remarks. And I hope that if you have questions, you have been putting them in the Q&A box. If not, please do so now. And Analese, if we have any questions, let's get into it.
Give everyone a minute or two to think of some questions.
Okay.
Okay, there's no questions.
No questions? While we're waiting, I can think of a few things that weren't really touched upon in the prepared remarks here. Number one, if you have received an MAEF grant in the past, yes, you are eligible to apply again. So please feel free. I think sometimes people are worried that it's a one and done. Building organizational capacity is a long-term relationship work. So please feel free to apply again. It looks like we've got a question now.
Okay, so to ask that, please give some specific examples of projects which serve people of color.
Oh, so projects that serve people of color, work that serves people of color. I mean, let's not divorce it from the fact that the organization leadership needs to be people of color as well. Work that serves people of color can fall into any sort of artistic discipline or, media possible. Again, I'm open, I'm interested. I think oftentimes we find in the arts funding community that there is a privilege that is attached to perhaps work in the Western canon, right? Work that descends from European traditions. We are open to things that are experimental, that are new, that reflect traditional or indigenous cultures that are perhaps underrepresented in the large institutional art world. Hip hop or new forms of art, multimedia, interdisciplinary. We are wide open, but let's make sure that we don't divorce, led by people of color and serving people of color. And serving people of color reflects what the community is interested in asking for. And for that, we got to take our lead from the organizations that are doing the work.
The next question is, can non-minority folks be involved in management and implementation of the project?
Yes, depending on what you mean by involved in. So we're looking for organizational leadership, and I'm talking, director level, executive director level that are people of color. If you are a person of color that leads an organization and you have non-people of color that are working with your organization, sure, that's, sadly and unfortunately in the nonprofit world, not terribly usual because of various inequities. People of color have less access to leading organizations. Or if you are not a person of color and somebody wants to hire you to provide some service to the organization, maybe it's fiscal oversight or maybe it's project planning, that's also acceptable as well.
The next question is, what if you are a teaching artist whose art is teaching the art as well as performing the art? Are you eligible for a fellowship?
If you are a teaching artist and you're seeking a fiscal agent, I would suggest you find an organization that is not tying or attempting to tie the grant to fulfillment of the teaching artist position, right? And it could be that you have a relationship with the organization that is that you are contracting with as a teaching artist that would enable them and you to work together on a related project. But it's really hard for artists to access funding for their own self-directed work. And that's the work that we want to support. I know that we don't really have an artist fellowship in Cleveland anymore. And I know that when it existed, it was, rightfully called out for some of the inequity in access for people of color. And that's what we're attempting to correct for in kind of a roundabout fashion here.
The next question is, say more about the grants for capacity. If the limit is 20K, may an org apply for a portion of the grants to support salary? In this respect, 20K is not a lot. That said, can you give a sense of what an appropriate portion, salary to other expenses, may be regarded to the total grant?
That's up to you. Salaries are necessary. So if you want to apply, if you applied for a $20,000 grant and you have like a $10,000 contract with a strategic planner, and you want to use $10,000 for administrative support, or salaries for the director who is going to be working on that as well. I mean, that's up to you. As the organization, we have to, again, in this respect, take our direction from the applicant organization about what is the most appropriate split. Just make sure it really accurately reflects your needs as an organization.
Next question is, on top of your head or in general, how many applications have been awarded funds to support Asian American communities in the past?
That's a great question. I don't know that I have the exact numbers. What I can tell you is this. In 2018, after we adopted the new guidelines, I have to say I was disappointed that we didn't get more applications from Asian American organizations. And that's 100% on us, right? Like, we needed to do the work to build the relationships. And we got significantly more applications last year from Asian American communities, and we're able to fund more work for Asian American arts organizations last year. And that felt like, I don't want to say a victory because it's actually just doing the bare minimum, but it felt good to realize that we had done the work that was necessary to build the relationships and get the word out. We need more. We need to do more. I know that there is so much that is going on, so much rich cultural and artistic work that is going on. I will say that through this process, I found out that it was the 100th anniversary of Asia Town and its current location in Cleveland. And I wouldn't have known that if we hadn't spent the time trying to build better links within the Asian American community. So, please, please, please spread the word, find more organizations that are doing the work. I will say that we had similar findings in the Middle Eastern community and the Muslim community as well. We're trying to do better. And thank you for asking specifically about Asian American communities.
Looks like that's all the questions for now. If anyone else has any more questions, please feel free to put in more. Maybe you could touch on fiscal sponsorship. I know last year there was a lot of questions on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Analese. So the 501c3 process can be cumbersome and, frankly, in some ways outdated, right, for arts organizations specifically. And sometimes people want to operate outside of the 501c3 system. As a foundation, we can only make grants per IRS regulations to nonprofits that do have 501c3 registration. And I want to differentiate that from having been recognized by the state of Ohio as a nonprofit. That's not the exact same thing. And that's something that we have encountered in the past. Understanding specifically that in communities of color, it's really difficult and perhaps undesirable to become a 501c3 on your own. We are open to accepting proposals from fiscally sponsored projects, meaning you're a collective of artists or a group of artists or an organization that is doing artistic work, and maybe you have a partnership with an organization that does have a 501c3 that can pursue an application on your behalf. You're going to have to put in the time to make sure that you are agreed on the back end about what the grant is going to be used for, how funds will be dispersed as needed, if it is meant to be in collaboration with the fiscally sponsored project or agent, or if it is really that the fiscal agent is holding the money and paying out the bills on behalf of the artist or the artist organization or collective. You need to spend the time making sure that that is all agreed. But as long as it is an organization in Northeast Ohio that has a 501c3, and you want to come in partnership with them, that's fine. That organization does not have to be an organization that is led by people of color, as long as it is, the project is directed by people of color, an artist or an artist collective that is led by people of color specifically. The fiscal agent is the organization, however, that is held responsible for the grant funds. So that includes reporting and making sure that, expenses are, incurred above board and legally. So it's not without its own considerations for a fiscal agent, but we are open to that, I think, in a way that perhaps some other funding opportunities at the Cleveland Foundation have not been open to that previously.
We have another question is, Courtney, how may we get in touch with you if if we have questions?
Yep, my email address is on the Cleveland Foundation website, but it is also cbarton, Barton, at cleve, CLEVEFDN.org. And I'll spell my first name for you because it's a little bit different. It's COURTENAY. Feel free to email me. Email is best because we're all working virtually right now, and getting me on the phone can be pretty difficult, especially around this time of year, because we're answering a lot of questions specifically about this fund. But if you do have questions, feel free to shoot me an email.
If there's any last minute questions, please add some more. Looks like right now we don't have any more.
Well, I'm glad to hear that it seems that we've answered your questions. I guess that makes sense because per the poll that we did at the opening of this webinar, it seems that a lot of you do have a lot of familiarity with this grant opportunity. I will just take this moment to reiterate, do think of this moment of crisis as the opportunity for you to think about what your organization needs to be sustainable, to keep the lights on, to keep doing it, what it is that you do, from a real, inside baseball perspective that you might not be able to get funding for from other places. Think of this as the opportunity to do that. I also want to say one thing that this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, and the revolution that's presently happening in our streets really drives home to me is that our artistic and creative community is essential. While everybody was, locked at home, it was the artists and arts organizations who went to work immediately, providing the social connection that we all needed virtually, continue to do so, lead a cultural change movement to lift up narratives that are now more than ever needed, and messages that are now more than needed, now needed more than ever. So thank you all for the work that you're doing, for the organizations that you represent. If you have questions, of course, please feel free to reach out to me. We will have information from this webinar posted on our website so that you will have access to this information. And with that, I guess I will say thank you and have a great Friday and a wonderful weekend.